momentarily. Morning, everyone. We'll be getting started just momentarily. We like to give everyone about 2 minutes for everyone to load into the Zoom session, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. Hope you're all doing well. This is our 8th webinar discussing COVID-19 and trade. We are going to keep trying to do these sessions as long as it remains relevant, and the shutdown orders are in place in DC until June, so that means we'll certainly be continuing these sessions until then. Next week, May 21st, we'll be discussing how ports and logistics have been impacted by the pandemic. You should have information in an email today from us. If you're having any trouble with your connection during the session today, we are also live streaming on YouTube, so you can watch it there. If you're on Zoom, we have the ability to ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can input your question there. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We'll group them if we have to and get to them after our panelists have some remarks and discussions. You should have, if you registered for this on Zoom, you should have received an email this morning with the biographies of all our participants and our event program for today. We're really excited for today's panel. We have a really great group of leaders in international trade and pharmaceuticals, and all of them are longtime friends of WITA. I want to say at the outset, we did reach out to some of the critics of the industry to take part in today's session. And while we weren't able to get them scheduled today, we do hope to address some of the issues that have been raised by them, both in this pandemic and before that, but related to intellectual property and access to medicines, as well as whether the United States is too reliant on China and other countries for its active pharmaceutical ingredients, API. So we hope these guests can address some of those questions. They've all long history working on these issues in Washington, and I'm delighted to have them join us here today. In one way or another, each of their companies or organizations are front and center in diagnostics, development of vaccines, and treatments for COVID-19, which are obviously critical issues facing the United States and the world. And of course, a special thanks to my good friend and partner in this series, Wendy Cutler. Thank you, Alyssa, Joe, Jonathan, and thanks again, Wendy, and the Asia Society Policy Institute for partnering with us on this series. With that, Wendy.
Well, thanks so much, Ken, and welcome everyone. And I can't believe it's already our 8th webinar. Really appreciate everyone joining us, and we really appreciate your input on not only topics we should be focusing on, but also your input on criticisms or suggestions on how we can improve these programs. Today we have a great lineup to discuss, really to focus on medicines, pharmaceuticals, both innovative and generic. We've spent a lot of time on medical supplies. Last week we focused on food. So today I think we've got a great lineup for this. Before we get to the discussion, I just wanted to kind of highlight 3 key trade developments over the past week. The first, as we all woke up this morning to find out that the WTO Director General, Roberto Azevedo, is going to be stepping down about a year earlier than the official expiration of his 2nd term in that position. The WTO, as we all know, is facing so many challenges already, including the situation with the appellate body, the reform agenda, the US-China kind of debate that's taking place bilaterally, but also in the WTO, and frankly, the COVID response. And on top of that now, in the United States, Senator Hawley has introduced a resolution for the US to withdraw from the WTO, which has also now been introduced in the House by 2 members as well. As someone who worked at USTR during many of the discussions about who should lead the World Trade Organization, I know this is a very political process and frankly, very time consuming. But given the extensive substantive agenda facing the WTO, I would hope that this election process would not detract from the substantive work. And frankly, WTO members find a way to do both at the same time. In other words, work with others about picking a successor, but also working on the key issues on their agenda. Now, pivoting to that, tomorrow the WTO is going to have an important meeting to discuss the COVID response and trade measures that have been taken in response to the COVID response. We have spent a lot of time discussing these, particularly export restrictions. Simon Evenett has joined us twice, and today I would just update with the latest numbers from him, which suggests that this export restriction is still very much on the front burner. According to Simon now, there are 83 jurisdictions, about 150 restrictions with respect to medical and medicines. And with respect to food, 27 jurisdictions have 38 restrictions in place. And again, tomorrow, my understanding is these types of measures will be on the agenda for WTO members to discuss them in detail. And finally, from me, as we've discussed in the past, the WTO has forecasted a sharp drop in global trade this year. And let's just say the numbers are bearing this out as you keep seeing countries report their export and import statistics. They're pretty sobering. And I would just share with you, I think Korea is the first country to report their May statistics. It's only for the first 10 days of May. But Korea's exports are down 46% and their imports are down 37%. Those are pretty steep declines. The latest data from the United States for the first quarter shows that US exports are down about 10%, while imports are down 6.2%. So with that, let's turn to today's event. Again, we're going to focus on medicines and how trade policies really factor into these discussions. This will take us into the land of intellectual property protection, supply chains, export restrictions, tariffs, but also the whole debate on onshoring and offshoring. And here, I would just highlight Ambassador Lighthizer op-ed earlier this week in the New York Times, when he was quite critical of past administrations for following trade policies that led to a lot of offshoring for the United States, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And he said, quote unquote, that this pandemic has revealed an over-reliance on other countries for critical medicines, medical devices, and protective equipment. So very relative to today's discussion. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn to our panelists. Ken has introduced them. We're going to start with Joe DeMond. And Joe, if I can just ask you to kind of kick it off and provide an overview of how the biotech sector is responding to COVID, both from like the US perspective, but also globally. And also, what role do trade policies, both practices as well as restrictions or liberalization, play into these issues? Over to you, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to put a few slides on the screen to describe, as best as we can tell, my organization, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, has been trying to do its best to compile all of the projects that are going on globally to address, with respect to developing diagnostics or treatments or vaccines to address COVID. And I'm going to try to get this on, okay, get this on the screen. And there it is. Okay. By the way, there's a lot more data where this came from, and there's an address there that you can go to find on Bio's website. So the first thing is, this has been remarkable. There's over 440, and we keep counting new ones every day, unique drug programs launched in a 16-week period. Let me just say, this is totally unprecedented in world history to have this number of programs aimed at one disease crop up in a 4-month period. And that's dating from, here you see, January, when week 1 after the SARS sequence was published by China on January 10th. Truly amazing. Also amazing is that really these are companies, private sector companies, which are doing the bulk of the work. There are some academic institutions, obviously, which are doing it, but the blue on these bar charts represent private sector companies doing it. 90% or more than 90% of all the work is being done by companies that have just jumped into the breach to try to find solutions. Just to give you an idea again of what kind of work is being done, you'll see that it's divided into 3 areas: vaccines, of which there are almost 100, antivirals and antibodies to treat the disease, and in other words, to directly attack the virus itself. And then finally, treatments for COVID-19 illness, which are dealing with the effects of the COVID-19 illness, respiratory symptoms, et cetera. So this is a broad diversity covering all the major areas. This is another remarkable aspect of it. If you think about those 440 projects, 75% or 76% of the projects that have been undertaken are small companies. These are either startup companies that don't even have commercial products in the market yet, or small cap companies. The large companies account for the rest of it. Of course, they're the ones you read a lot about. They're obviously a big part of what's going on too. But the amazing thing is, as I said, of the 440 projects, 3/4 of them are small. And by the way, that's pretty consistent with the drug development ecosystem, if you're not aware of that about 3/4 of all new drugs today originate with small companies. And finally, here's the global breakdown. The US, it is a global effort, but you can see that the US accounts for a little bit more than half, 51%, more than all the other countries in the world put together. Though, again, there's a multiplicity of other countries who are involved. China's number 2 on this list. The US has 221 of the projects. China has 32, and it goes down from there. Most of these countries are OECD members, although you'll see a few projects in India, a few in Russia there as well. So I can say, whatever you say elsewhere with respect to US leadership on COVID, and in a policy sense, I know that's can be questioned. Certainly from a scientific and technical perspective, the US is leading. And odds are that the treatments and many of the significant treatments, most probably will originate from the US. Although we don't know exactly of these, and I'm just playing the odds on this. With respect to the world trading system and its impact on this, let me just say that over the last 25 years, as these numbers imply, a very broad global ecosystem, which started in the US, which actually started the biotech industry about 30 years ago. But in the last 25 or so, biotech and drug development industry has spread globally. That was made very much possible by the fact that global IP standards have increased, and they were always strong here in the US. One of the reasons why the US is leading the world. But those standards have spread around the world, not only have allowed other countries to develop their capacity, but importantly have allowed for cross-border collaboration. Anecdotally, and I don't have the numbers on this, anecdotally, a lot of these projects are cross-border. Scientists, companies that have different pieces of technology are approaching, partnering. I think the bio website that I mentioned at the beginning has more information on that. You can see that. This kind of collaboration would not be possible if we didn't have some sort of standard of expected intellectual property protection globally. In addition, the fact that you have hundreds of small companies in the mix here wouldn't have been possible more than 25 years ago. You would have just seen the bigs developing this. That spate and growth of small companies in the last 25 years has also been made possible by the development and the strengthening of the global IP system, because these small companies rely on venture capital to get started and to finance, and venture capital companies or other financiers don't finance projects that don't have intellectual property rights, because there's nothing that they're taking a risk. They need that to take their risk. And then I would say finally, the open global trading system going forward, we'll get more into these discussions, is going to be necessary for including low tariffs, including any other barriers to trade, whether it be quotas or import or export quotas, are going to be critical to ensuring that population around the world get access to medicines. And this is obviously truly a global problem. If the virus is still active and virulent in one part of the world, then there's always a chance it's going to come back to your country, even if you think it's under control. So it's really going to be necessary and important to make sure that it's dealt with and addressed globally. So I'll stop there for now and look forward to the discussion. And I will turn my slides off. Thanks, Wendy.
And thanks for giving us this great overview, in particular to underscore the role of small companies. That's news to me, as well as the international collaboration here. Alyssa, I would ask you if you, you're from Pfizer. We all know that Pfizer's on the forefront of developing a vaccine, and anything you can share with us on your progress on the vaccine would be helpful. And I recognize this is a trade event, so then I think would be really useful. Pfizer is both, an innovator, but also a manufacturer of these drugs. If you can give us a sense how your company kind of factors in all these trade policies, and including the offshoring, onshoring debate. We'll get into that more, but the issue of supply chains, export restrictions, tariffs, and IPR. I think that would, be of interest to our viewers.
Sure. So we are one of the companies on Joe's impressive chart who are, trying to develop a potential vaccine for COVID. We have some other projects on other components of the discovery process for COVID. But on our vaccine program, we had an exciting announcement last week. We started dosing our first patients in the United States as part of phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. I think that our vaccine program really does reflect a lot of the points that Joe just made. We have a partner, a German company called BioNTech, and this really is a global development program for this vaccine. There was another cohort in Germany that were dosed earlier. The other thing that I would highlight from that announcement is that in conjunction with the announcement about the clinical trials starting, we also announced some of our manufacturing plans. And I think that is really significant. We have 3 states that we've identified which will be manufacturing centers for the vaccine: Michigan, Massachusetts, and Missouri. We also identified a site in Belgium, and we announced that we will be identifying additional sites as we go forward. And hopefully, if we're successful, we expect to be able to produce millions of vaccine doses this year and increase to hundreds of millions next year. So I think that the manufacturing part of it, the other thing that I think is worth highlighting is that in addition to the scale of research that you're seeing, there's also this incredible amount of that people are deploying to bring products to market. So where you might have seen a sort of stage process of development where you have phase 1 clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3, maybe then you start trying to develop your manufacturing plan. A lot of companies like ours are thinking about this, trying to really accelerate and compress the normal life cycle of innovation and push it into a very narrow windows. And we're doing that at risk. So the phase 1 and 2 clinical trials are going to go in parallel effectively for this vaccine. And we are investing in manufacturing, and it's all happening not sequentially, but in parallel and at risk. So, but I think your question about what we're seeing, as you said, we are a major manufacturer of medicine. So I thought it would be helpful maybe to talk a little bit about what our supply chain is bringing to me on a daily basis, and the kinds of policies that we think would be helpful to really make sure that we can get our medicines to patients who need them quickly. So obviously, we're trying to work as a company to really compress the innovation timeline and to stand up our manufacturing. But there are policies that I think would help if governments were to pursue them in the trade space to really make that more effective. So I think just to run down, I'm going to say five policies that I think would really help. And then I'm going to mention 2 that I think really wouldn't help. So the first, and the first is trade facilitation. And trade facilitation, it's not glamorous, but I can say from conversations with our supply chain guys, it's really important. Medicines have to get where they need to go quickly and efficiently. And that's true for COVID treatments. It's also true for everything else that we're making right now to help make sure hospitals have what they need on hand to treat patients. Customs restrictions, consularization, inefficient clearance procedures, inconsistent border administration. This is all stuff that we've been talking about in trade circles for years. It was a big project at the WTO. It's not glamorous stuff, but boy, does it create red tape, and frankly, this stuff should be addressed now. If we want to get patients the medicines they need, we want them to deploy quickly, let's take care of these barriers now so that we can really get things moving quickly. Governments should think about expedited procedures for release of COVID-related medical supplies. You know, this is the kind of stuff that we should be starting to think about now so that when the therapies are there, when the vaccines are there, they can move very quickly. A second thing, you mentioned it, Wendy, tariff elimination. So 2 decades ago, a number of governments agreed to the WTO to drop tariffs on medicines and inputs. I think this is worth a second look today. There's been changes to technology and tariff classifications, and frankly, the agreement is not as comprehensive as it should be. Many major economies have not joined the agreement. And I know many governments are starting to think about tariff elimination on medicines even beyond the WTO. We should think about tariff inversion, which can distort manufacturing incentives. So that's a focus maybe on the inputs to medicine side. The third thing I would mention is transparency. Governments need to be transparent about all the measures they are adopting to address supply chain issues. And frankly, to date, it's been a less than perfect story. Governments need to notify their measures to the WTO. Published, they should be readily understandable and designed in a way that companies can predict how they would be applied. We are seeing a lot of churn with rules on supply chains, and that churn is really disruptive. I mean, I can just say that, you know, with if a company is trying to get its medicines to patients, and you know, they've got a new rule that just came out, you know, and day to day they don't really know what the rules are going to be. It makes it really hard for them to have the confidence to through that market. A fourth thing I would mention is safety and security. Governments will need effective risk-based policies in place to deter illicit trade, including trading counterfeit medicines. We're starting right now. The regulatory environment should be designed to facilitate medicines that are safe and effective. How, like other industries, it would be helpful to have coordination on standards, safety protocols for transit. You know, again, this is not glamorous stuff, but it's really, really, really important. And the last thing I would highlight, and I think this goes back to your remarks, Wendy, at the beginning, we need governments to work together. And I think WTO is really more important than ever. But whether this cooperation through the WTO, G20, the upcoming G7 meetings, APEC, we need governments to really collaborate and not treat this as a zero-sum game. We really need to recognize that this is not the same problem as we might have had. I mean, I worked, as you know, at USTR, worked on a lot of steel issues in the past. This is a different problem. This is a global pandemic, and we have to lift all boats. So that's where I think we would like to see governments really working together more and identifying solutions that really help all patients everywhere. So, and then I'll just touch.
We have a few things that government shouldn't do. I think we'll probably get to those in our questions and answers.
Okay, all right, I'll leave it there. Fair enough. Okay.
Okay, and it was an upbeat note also, so that was good.
All right.
Jonathan, if I can turn to you from the generic industry perspective, maybe you can share with us, particularly the supply chain issue. You know, there is a real push now by the administration to want to bring the production back to the United States, particularly in the medicine / ingredients area. So I'd really, and the audience would really welcome your perspective on these issues. And well, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And the goal of onshoring and increasing US production of generic medicines is something we support, but it has to be done in a way where the policy environment is conducive to allowing those investments to expand effectively. And so the Association for Accessible Medicines, the association I work with, has just recently come out with a blueprint that we launched a couple weeks ago that lays out a description of how we think the policy framework can be put in place to actually allow companies to make financially rational decisions to bring those investments onshore into the United States, as well as expand investments that are already here in the United States. The first step that has to be done is HHS, and we believe HHS should be given the authority to identify a list of products that would be high priority for US manufacturing. Now, to get to that list, we envision a two-step process. The first step would be defining what is an essential medicines list for the United States. What drugs are most important for the US healthcare system, and what drugs are most important for American patients. Based on that list, there should be an assessment made of how vulnerable is the US pharmaceutical supply chain for those medicines. Where are our vulnerabilities and where are our strengths? Where are products manufactured? Where are ingredients manufactured? Where are they sourced? And how many companies are involved in the production for that group of essential medicines? And based on that assessment, we would recommend that HHS identify a list of high priority products for US manufacturing. We're talking to our membership, we assume that will be about between 150 and 200 drugs, which would then form the target list for companies to provide their own individual response and proposals on how they can help secure the US pharmaceutical supply chain. Now, they would present these proposals to HHS, and the way manufacturing works is you can have a finished dosage plant that can manufacture 20, 30, 40, even 50 or more molecules in a single manufacturing plant through batch production. But it's also possible, so that's one way, is sort of either launching a new greenfield investment, possibly bringing online idle manufacturing capabilities in the United States that for some reason companies have decided for market reasons that they've shut down over the last many years. So bringing some of those back, or even just switching a line that's already taking place in the United States. Our membership alone, and we represent 24 generic companies out of more than 200 that are on the US market. Our membership produces 61 billion doses of generic medicines every year and employs about 35,000 employees. So there's investment happening, but companies can actually expand that investment or retool lines that exist already. So you can either retool an existing line to manufacture medicines on that high priority list. You can bring back out of capacity, or you can launch a greenfield investment. But part of those proposals would need to be grant requests from the US government. The US government will have to help alleviate some of the high costs of bringing these manufacturing plants online. We estimate that for a finished dosage plant, it can take 3 to 7 years, costs of hundreds of millions of dollars for greenfield investment. If you're talking API, it can take up to 10 years and $1 billion. And while again, for finished dosage, you can have 30, 40, or 50 or more molecules in a plant. For API, it's much less. It's in the low single digits. So they would propose grants, but also, and what is most important for our companies, our long-term guaranteed contracts for price and volume. The big concern of our membership is if you launch a $800 million investment and the day after you open that investment, cheap imported products come and make those products non-competitive in the US market, which is a very commoditized market for the generic industry, then that plant has no market viability. So the government, for only government direct purchases of medicines, should provide long-term volume and price contracts. Now that would be for the Strategic National Stockpile and any agency utilizing the federal supply schedule to purchase drugs. So that's the VA, that's DOD, that's other agencies such as the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons. So any agency that's directly procuring could be part of these long-term supply and volume, price and volume contracts. Now we also think it's important for tax incentives to be put into place and regulatory reforms to happen within the FDA. The tax incentives, again, can offset the high cost bringing these plants online. And the regulatory reforms can help make it more efficient to bring those online. Right now, there's a number of offices within the FDA that have a role in approving marketing or manufacturing sites. We would like to see greater coordination within the FDA, as well as a greater dialogue between the manufacturer and the FDA, similar to the way that the FDA engages in structured dialogue with companies that are providing dossiers for efficacy and safety approvals. Finally, and I echo Elisa's last comment, we think it's very important to have global cooperation in this space. The United States cannot manufacture all the medicines needed for our patients. Neither can any country. And so we think it's really important that governments come together to cooperate and coordinate manufacturing, especially because so many governments are putting together incentive programs. India, Japan, Canada is considering this, the UK is considering this, Germany is considering this. A lot of our allies are also trying to increase the security of their own production. We should work together as the US and its allies through a plurilateral agreement to find commonality and through an international pharmaceutical supply chain agreement. And we think that can provide the security necessary to enhance the reliability and resilience of the US pharmaceutical supply chain. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. And maybe I can just follow up with you first, because I think you've really touched on the whole onshoring, offshoring debate and really gave us some useful insights about what onshoring means, what it involves, and what type of policies, not necessarily trade policies either. But one question I do want to ask you and the others is that there seems to be a lot of different data floating around about how reliant we are on China and others for essential medicines and ingredients. And I've seen numbers like range from 13% to 50 to 80. The numbers seem to be all over the map. And in preparing for this event, I was shocked to see how many reports are out there, which even confused me more. The WTO's put a great report out. The US Chamber has, the St. Louis Fed has, CRS has, and now the ITC has come out with a report. You just suggested maybe that there be a process where the HHS tries to identify products. But can you just help us understand why is there so much confusion on these numbers? Why is the range so great?
The challenge right now is anyone is really guessing at the percentage of API manufactured anywhere in the world. No one is collecting the data on how much volume is being produced at manufacturing sites. The FDA, at a hearing that they had on Capitol Hill, Janet Woodcock presented last October that only 13% of manufacturing sites for US marketed products are in China. The US has 28%, and the rest of the world is, I think, 59%. Now, if you look at Commerce, so that's on manufacturing sites. If you look at Commerce Department trade data, where they look at volume, China has 15% of the volume, looking at the value of imported API, China has 15%. Ireland has something like 43%. So no one, though, has concrete data on what that volume is. And that's actually what one of the things that came out of the CARES Act is a requirement that manufacturers provide the FDA with more information on the volume of API manufacturers are putting into their medicines and where that volume is coming from. So we will know more, but right now, unfortunately, there's just not enough concrete information to have a clear sense of what data makes sense.
Okay, well, thank you. Joe or Alyssa, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think just to echo what Jonathan just said, for our part, we have looked at least our manufacturing and production of the medicines that we sell here in the US, and a very, very small percentage of API and critical materials that go into those products come from China. That's just our story. That's just one manufacturer, but I think it shows that a lot of the really big numbers just are probably not accurate, and I think we'll find out more as we implement the CARES Act.
Okay, if I maybe then can pivot to the issue of Buy America, and 2 weeks ago we had a great discussion in this forum where we invited different speakers, including Scott Paul from the Alliance for American Manufacturing. And I thought he put forward a reasonable and compelling case for why Buy America restrictions in the medicine / API medical equipment area are needed. And I'm going to paraphrase him here. And if he's watching, I apologize if I'm not getting this correct. But he seemed to highlight a number of reasons, including the overdependence on China, the fact that all countries are kind of operating in their self-interest in this space now, and we've seen that with lots of export restrictions. His view is that if we can bring more production home through a Buy America Act, that will make us more prepared for future emergencies, and hopefully no other pandemics, but possibly. It can also help us be in a better position to assist developing countries that are, are woefully behind in this area. And also he makes the point, look, we have Buy America, on a lot of different products in the United States. Other countries do as well. So this isn't like an unprecedented policy. So I wanted to put those out there and to see, and maybe I'll turn to Joe first, if you have any comments on these, or, from your perspective, why don't you agree with these, or why do you think, or what's he missing? What has he left out? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Wendy. A few comments. First, a general comment, which is, I think in principle, what you would want to do with respect to sources of any essential supply is ensure redundancy in the system and not over-reliance on any one particular source. That's what we have in the world today. And we do have some drugs coming in from China. We have some coming in from Ireland, as was noted. We have some coming in from other countries, and we've got a lot of domestic production. That's what you want, in part because you don't know in the next crisis which drugs you're going to actually need for the crisis. So you want to build as much redundancy, resilience into the system as you can. You don't want to have it all located in one place or one or two places. That doesn't just benefit a big country like the US, but smaller countries obviously can't. If the disease is spreading in a smaller country, they're going to have to rely on global trade, and that disease is going to come to the US. As I said, it's a global phenomenon. So just to look at it in terms of the US in isolation makes no sense. Within context of COVID, let me just say this. We're not over-reliant on other countries because there are no treatments for COVID. In fact, most of the treatments for COVID are going to come from the US probably, and the one that's been identified, remdesivir, is a US product. So, to say, and you haven't heard stories about shortages in, with respect to other drugs. You've heard countries taking some actions, some of which have been rescinded since then. But I think we have to keep in mind that, as I said before, you don't know where these crises are going to come from, and the source of innovation is very much already here in the US. The final point I just want to say is this is outside the context of COVID, when this crisis is over. Those of you who have not been following the industry may not be aware that many countries in the world already, and maybe Scott was trying to get at this point, but already we're trying to localize drug production in their country. China was one of these, but there were other large countries that were trying to do the same. In other words, you had countries trying to say to US producers, if you want to have access to our market, you've got to produce locally. And they put a lot of and not so much through direct trade policies, but through regulatory policies or other behind the border policies. So these countries have been trying to get US innovative companies to locate abroad for a number of years. If the US starts to go down the route of saying you got to produce it here in the US, you've got to ask the question, what are other countries going to do? And is it going to encourage other countries to go down the same road? And the reason I point this out is with respect to innovative new medicines, the US is one of the world's largest exporters and producers. And so if we start a beggar thy neighbor type cycle in place, we have a lot to lose in that regard. And in fact, potentially, if what we're talking about is onshoring the low margin generic price drugs, as Jonathan was alluding to, we could be in a position of trading our production of innovative products, which the Chinese and other countries could say, you've got to produce there for more generic production here in the US. And I don't really see why that's a very good industrial policy for the US to trade the innovative industry or the balance of the innovative industry for the low margin products.
So before I turn it over to Ken, who's going to field questions from the audience, let me just ask one more question, and that is with respect to intellectual property protection, and particularly the issue of compulsory licensing. As we all know, in the TRIPS agreement, there are provisions that in an emergency, countries can follow compulsory licensing, and in order to get safe access, reliable access to affordable medicines. What do you think the prospects are for countries to invoke these procedures? Are you concerned about them? Do you see the validity? And what are you trying to do to perhaps allay those concerns of developing countries? Who wants to take that?
Unless Alyssa wants to, I can start. Again, sorry for doing all this talking, but first of all, I think the question isn't really whether, I think the question we should be focused on really isn't whether a country has a right to compulsory license. We know what the TRIPS rules say, and they do talk about public health emergencies. The question really is whether it's the right thing to do, whether it's the best strategy for making sure that your patients in your country have access to new medicines. And I just want to point out that the reality of developing these new medicines, again, there's only one that's been proven to have some beneficial effect. No vaccine and no others, no novel drugs. But the reality is it takes a tremendous amount of effort to develop the know-how, to go through the testing, to go through the regulatory approval, to make sure that a product that is new is going to be effective in treating patients with COVID-19. And the expedient thing to do, I would think in most cases, is to work with the company who has gone through the process of developing this know-how, which is going to be very new knowledge and not very, not tested too broadly probably yet. Instead of going through a legal process of trying to figure out how to get that knowledge, that regulatory approval to another company who hasn't been involved in it. We're very much, I'd say very much it's going to be necessary for partnerships that have already started in this area, because I don't know that any one company can do it on its own. Maybe some of the bigger ones can, but the one product that has been shown to be effective and safe is remdesivir, which is Gilead's product. And Gilead has announced already that it's going to do voluntary licenses with 4 companies and to provide access in 127 countries around the world. In fact, in addition, they're going to do royalty-free during the duration of the COVID crisis. So our companies have said, I think similarly, generally their interest, they're in this area because it's important to them to make sure that people get access to these medicines in an effective way. And I think this is the best and going to be the most efficient and expedient way to making sure that whatever the new drugs are, and we don't know who is going to develop them. So it's kind of fruitless to ask what's going to happen with the IP because we don't know which companies it's going to involve, whether it's going to be a startup company or a very large company like Alyssa's. It's really going to depend, and the kind of partnerships are going to depend on that as well.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say, I think what Joe said is exactly right. I mean, look, we understand that limited, narrow use of compulsory license to address a national health emergency is appropriate. If all other options are exhausted, you got to kind of step back and ask yourself whether it's going to be the most effective way to get the treatments to the people who need them. And as Pfizer, we are committed to working directly with governments and other stakeholders to ensure that any potential treatment or vaccine that we develop to address coronavirus is accessible to people who need them. And I think that Joe made a good point that the incentives provided by the IP system they're what enable us to build the infrastructure that allows us to quickly mobilize and devote resources, technical knowledge, know-how that's required to combat the pandemic. So I just think that it shouldn't be the first resort. The first thing in mind is compulsory licensing. There's a lot more effective ways to make sure that people get what they need
Okay, well, thank you. And I think the effective is important, but also, let's just say, affordable is as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken, who will ask questions from the audience.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks, everybody. Alyssa, unfortunately, your audio is breaking up a little right at the when you're getting to the money part of your answer there. And I might ask if you just could lean in a little bit. Because we did have a direct question about what Pfizer would be doing if the vaccine proves effective to make sure that community, setting aside compulsory license, what's Pfizer going to do to make sure that communities, poor countries can get access to the vaccine?
You know, it's a good question. I understand why it's top of mind for everyone. I mean, we're all moving very quickly. As I said earlier, we're moving at risk to trials in parallel. We're scaling up manufacturing now, and of course, the goal is to get the medicines to patients that need them. So those access questions are very much top of mind. And so we're thinking about those issues right now, as I know other companies are. But I think going back to Joe's point, the conversation that we need to have with governments and other stakeholders, we need to work out the thinking around those questions in a collaborative way. And so we're very much thinking about those issues. Again, the whole goal here is to scale up and move very quickly as possible to get whatever treatments or vaccines we're able to develop into the hands of patients. So of course, access is part of that, and it's something that we are very much thinking about right now as a company.
Thanks, Alyssa. Actually, interesting question that came in, and our panelists can see these from Virginia Lenahan, and that is a question about a concern with counterfeit pharmaceuticals in the marketplace. Jonathan, that may be one. I know you've done a lot of work on supply chains, but any of our panelists can answer. Do you think that that's something we need to be vigilant about? And sort of a related question goes to the China phase 1 deal, and are there issues related to their ability to meet its obligations about counterfeit products? Joe, maybe Jonathan. Joe.
Well, I can just say there's always going to be this risk. And I would, first of all, let me just say there's a lot of false remedies being peddled out there on the internet that aren't even counterfeit, because there aren't really any, there's only, as I said, very few products have been clinically shown and approved by the FDA or other regulatory agencies to actually work. So it's too early to say, but it stands to reason that once some effective treatments are developed, and we know that global demand for them is going to be tremendous, and we know that it's going to, whatever the case, take time to scale up production, that people are going to be opportunistic about that, and we are going to have to be very vigilant about that. I can't think of anything much more reprehensible than peddling counterfeit drugs to people in time of a global pandemic, but I think people will probably try to do that. It's going to take, and it's again, this just goes back to the point of the need for global cooperation, because borders are going to have to be patrolled, internal measures are going to have to be taken. I think this is going to be more of a problem, obviously, in developing countries than developed, but they'll probably need all countries will probably need access to good technology and good methods of patrolling this. So global cooperation is going to be key.
Jonathan, did you have anything to add there?
I was just going to echo, the point on global cooperation is where I was going to go with my answer too. I mean, I think the challenge on counterfeits is something that governments have been working on and cooperating together for many years, and it's not going to subside soon. But it is through that type of close cooperation, and especially in terms of customs controls, that where things are going to have to happen. But also in terms of the interaction between the corporations, the individual companies, and customs, and ensuring there's that dialogue where that support can be found to help alleviate any of these concerns regarding counterfeits. I mean, we've seen increased counterfeits in many countries over the last decade or so, and we just want to make sure in this time of crisis that we're putting in place measures to stop that from happening to the extent possible.
Thank you. There's two questions that came in from both Andrea Durkin and Bruce Aitken. One is, and I think it's for all the panelists, but do you anticipate an impetus towards some international negotiations on global trading rules related to medical devices, equipment, and should we be looking at pharmaceuticals and medical equipment and things related to COVID as one big sector, or do we need to think of these somewhat separately? Anyone?
Well, I would say there's a lot of logic to treating health, health goods together, and to trying to load barriers to all of them. I mean, our health systems are, medicines are part of it, but other health technologies are also part of it. And sometimes to get a solution to a disease, you need, contribution of all these different parts. I think it's not realistic to expect some sort of agreement in the midst of a crisis. We're having a tough enough time as it is. I think that getting some sort of standstill, which is kind of what I think people are looking at least in terms of not imposing new barriers, is going to be the best we can do for now, if we get that, whether implicit or explicit. And then, turning to both expanding the reach of the so-called 0 for 0 agreements in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, and the scope of them. The pharma agreement, for example, has a list of products that needs to be updated. It never is because the WTO process is too onerous. These are all things that should be addressed, but I think, and maybe Wendy can comment on this too. I mean, that all of those types of steps are kind of tied up because of the bigger problems that the WTO itself is having. Can you even address one issue in isolation from all the others, even if it's as urgent as this one? I mean, it's indicative of the state of the world trading system. That's going to be, I think, the impediment.
If I can just add to what Joe said, because when you look at measures that are being put in place in the whole medical area, while I emphasize the proliferation of export restrictions, there's another trend going on we've talked about in the past, and that is many countries, frankly, are suspending, or some are getting rid of, but some are just suspending their tariffs now, because they're recognizing how important it is for them to be able to import these goods, both medicines and medical equipment. So yeah, I mean, the WTO is facing so many challenges, and its negotiating agenda is full, but yet not showing a lot of progress. But as a trade negotiator, when I look at trends, like if countries are already suspending these tariffs, then it seems to me maybe there is an opening for more work to be done here, because let's be honest, I think the world was unprepared for this, and I think we're learning a lot about trade in all of these products, both on the supply chain side, but also on the export restriction and tariff side as well.
I do think we just need to be vigilant in that regard, because if or when a vaccine is developed, there's going to be real pressure for governments and countries where those vaccines are developed to ensure they're supplying domestic populations first. And how we as an industry work together to promote that free flow of goods across borders is very important now. It will be even more important when that vaccine comes to market.
Just to add to that point, I mean, I also think that we need to understand that our supply chains, and this may be also true for PPE as well, they're incredibly complex. And if you look at Joe's chart of the amount of innovation that's happening and how global the partnerships are, I think governments that think that they can get a monopoly on the cures, that they can somehow, hold for themselves the innovation that's happening here, is really not realistic. So there may be multiple treatments or vaccines that are ultimately developed. There may be lots of different scenarios for how they're manufactured and deployed globally. So I think it does come back to government cooperation, but that to me is sort of why governments really should have an incentive now to cooperate. It is not going to be the case that one government is going to be able to command the solution to this crisis. That is just not going to happen. So people need to work together. And I also would just say that I know we talk a lot about new negotiations, but I also think there is a place here for the rules that exist. And on export restrictions, I think it was worrisome how quickly governments moved to take measures that they regarded perhaps as allowed in exceptional circumstances for human health and safety. But it is far from clear to me that those measures are actually doing anything to promote health and safety in this environment. So I think that we do need to take a second look at whether or not the measures that are being adopted are being applied consistently with the existing rules. And we need to think a little more carefully about whether or not they're actually serving their purpose.
And thank you, Alyssa. And I think kind of playing off this theme a little bit, and Joe, I want to turn to you maybe. And it's just, we have our WITA audiences are mixed. We have some experts here, but not all our experts. And there's a difference between small molecules and biologics, and the ability to create generics out of those and develop facilities to manufacture these products, which in the biologics case I know can take a long time. Can you maybe if everyone if countries were to try to force localization of some sort, is that even practical with some of the products that your companies are making and developing, when it's so complicated to be able to create some of these medications?
Well, that's a good point. Yes, biologics are more difficult to manufacture. They involve the genetic modification of proteins, and it has to be done very carefully. There's a lot of capital that goes into that. It takes time to develop, and it takes a lot of experience to do it effectively. And a lot of things can go wrong in the development of a biologic. Now, we don't know whether the treatments or the antivirals that are going to deal with COVID are going to be biologics or not. But if they are, there are limited places to do that. I also think that, scale and the scalability is really going to be important, probably both to supply and to cost. I mean, if people are concerned about affordability and cost, and of course they should be, developing 50 sites around the world where very small batches of a product are made is not a good way to ensure affordability, just from a cost perspective of a new medicine. So you've got to recognize that there are going to be probably a smaller number of places, not one, but because in a global, to deal with this globally, there's going to have to be several, but not every country is going to have one. And again, and that's going to need to be expedited, going back to, I think, some points Alyssa was making, to get production up and running. It's going to take, but again, this goes back to the issue of collaboration. Instead of building walls, we should be building bridges between countries if we're really serious about solving this.
Jonathan, it looks like you were going to chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, because whether it's biosimilars or small molecule drugs, I think it's not just about creating the conditions for companies to open a manufacturing facility, but it's really also about creating the market conditions for the market itself to flourish. And we're seeing challenges, and I imagine Joe and Alyssa can talk about challenges that their side of the industry is facing too, and actually being able to effectively sell into the market at effective prices. Joe mentioned that the generic industry is very low margins. It's true. And so, but there are built-in impediments into that market that need to be addressed if the US is really looking to build out and solidify a US-based generic manufacturing facility and marketplace. And so we would like to see not only the idea of looking at how do we get the investments here, but how do we create the environment where those investments stay here because there's a market that makes sense and its ability for the companies to sell into that market.
And if I can, sorry, and we're going to run just long because I want to just kind of try to tie a bow on one aspect of this. And it's been a really thoughtful and conversation with a lot of important information, but with a great need for the products that your companies are developing right now, with both national governments and in the United States, states competing to get their hands on these medications as quickly as possible. How do we create a situation where it's a controlled environment to some extent, where people are getting the right medicines in the right places at the right times? What kind of cooperation are we going to need to see so that that happens and we avoid the problem, where we saw faulty test kits were getting in people's to states, I assume to foreign governments and the other governments and countries as well, causing huge, problems. In the States, we've heard all these stories about people outbidding each other for these products. I mean, if it's the Wild West, it seems like we're headed for a disaster when these drugs, these medications hit the marketplace, and vaccines and other things. I mean, what can we be doing? And is there a level? I know, having myself worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a time several years ago, companies can't even talk about price with each other because that's there's anti-competitive reasons. So how is this going to happen in a really time-sensitive way?
Ken, I think you should have a separate session on that question, because I mean, that is a huge question. It's going to take governments to actually negotiate in good faith with each other to do that. Because look, I mean, I won't speak for Alyssa, but she's with a big company, and you can ask her, well, where is Pfizer going to produce this product? Well, if the U.S. government tells them you've got to produce it here, how much choice are they going to have? That's an important question. Are companies even going to be allowed to take these measures, even if they want to? So it's going to be up to governments to really set the global framework. And, it depends on so the answer to your question depends on your degree of optimism or pessimism about countries actually getting along and coming up with, mutually beneficial solutions.
Alyssa, were you going to chime in?
Yeah, I would just add though that I think that is true. I also think though that the private sector, the way that these projects are being organized can help inform the way that this plays out ultimately. The fact that you have global collaboration, the fact that you have multiple partners involved in the project, and you may be deploying manufacturing in multiple locations in recognition of the fact that these are, in the private sector partnerships, that these are projects involve multiple players in different locations. So I think that is true, that the governments are going to have a role to play, but I also think that, given how many of these projects are structured, there will be a good foundation for global deployment of whatever comes out of them.
I agree with that, as long as governments don't get in the way of that.
Thank you. We have several people from the U.S. government and other governments around the world, actually quite a few embassies watching, so hopefully they are taking notes, and they'll probably be in touch with all of you. Wendy, can you wrap us up?
Okay. Well, and I'll be brief. I thought this was a great discussion. I think that Joe made a good suggestion. I don't think we've exhausted this topic. I think this just raises more questions and more issues. For me, I found very impressive learning about all the efforts made by the range of US companies, both big and small, with respect to treatments, therapeutics, and vaccines. On behalf of me and my family and everyone viewing, and probably everyone in the world, while we appreciate your efforts, can you all work harder and work faster? Thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more, and really apologies for not getting to all the questions. We did try to get to as many of them as we could. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, we did invite some other people who've been critical of the industry, who've been focused on issues like the API from China issue, We were not able to arrange for them to be on this session, but we did reach out to them. We also reached out to Gabby and some others. So we did want to cover a lot here. Joe, I always appreciate the opportunity to tee up a future WITA event, so thank you for giving us that. Happy to do that on this topic and all the other topics. We hope everyone joins us again next week. We'll be announcing upcoming events in the next few days as well, so please keep an eye on your emails. We're even talking to a group called Registrar Corp about doing a special session on FDA regulations for imports of products. So keep a lookout in your email for that, everybody. Thank you very much. And with that, we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.